I hid my immense wealth and my position as CEO from my fiancé to see if his family would love the real me. Instead, his mother shoved a 50-page prenup in my face at a Michelin star restaurant and told me to know my place. I smiled, signed the document, and secretly set a legal trap that would cost them everything. My name is Clara, 33 years old, and while I run one of the most ruthless venture capital firms in Manhattan, my fiancé David believes I am an administrative assistant who struggles to pay rent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The chandelier above our table at Le Bernardin cast a warm glow contrasting the freezing tension in the air. I had barely taken a sip of my water when Beatrice David's mother reached into her designer bag and slammed a thick stack of legal documents next to my appetizer. The loud thud made the couple at the adjacent table stare. "Sign this before the main course arrives," Beatrice demanded, her voice slicing through the quiet hum of the restaurant. "We need to protect our legacy. A girl from your working-class background cannot expect to marry into wealth without safety measures." I stared at the thick document. The bold letters across the top read, "Prenuptial Agreement." I looked across the table at David, expecting him to intervene or say something about how inappropriate it was to ambush me during our engagement dinner. Instead, he just swirled his wine and looked away. Beatrice leaned forward, her diamond necklace catching the light. "Do not look at him, Clara. This was my idea, but David agrees. You have to understand our position. You are a nice girl, but you type emails for a living. You rent a tiny apartment in Queens. Our family has corporate assets and a reputation to maintain. We cannot risk a gold digger dismantling what took generations to build." Her words were meant to humiliate me, and based on the sympathetic glances from the waitstaff, she was succeeding. I kept my expression completely neutral, though my mind was racing. The irony was suffocating. The family company she was desperate to protect was bleeding capital, and my firm had just secretly purchased a massive portion of their corporate debt. But Beatrice did not know that. She only saw a poor girl in a simple dress. "Speaking of your dress," Beatrice continued, gesturing at my outfit with a manicured hand, "I know you want to look your best, but please do not wear off-brand clothing to our public events anymore. It is embarrassing. My daughter will take you shopping next week. We will buy you something with a recognizable logo so you do not look like you just got off a bus." I glanced down at my dress. It was a custom-tailored silk piece from Loro Piana, worth more than the entire table's meal, but because it lacked a flashy logo, Beatrice assumed it was cheap. "I am comfortable in what I am wearing," I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly polite, "but I appreciate your concern for the family image." She scoffed, taking a bite of her caviar. "It is not just about the image, Clara. It is about reality. You bring absolutely no financial value to this union. If you divorce my son, you will leave with exactly what you brought into this relationship: nothing. Section 4 states you will receive no alimony. Section 9 dictates you will be responsible for 30% of all shared household expenses, even though you barely make minimum wage. We are being fair." I picked up the heavy document, flipping through the pages. The terms were completely predatory. They were designed to ensure I would be entirely dependent on David, trapped in a marriage where I had no financial leverage whatsoever. It was financial abuse disguised as legal protection. David finally spoke up with a weak, apologetic smile. "Babe just read it over quickly," he said, reaching out to pat my hand condescendingly. "My mom is only looking out for the business. It is just a formality. We love you, but business is business." I stared at the man I was supposed to marry. A man who was perfectly fine watching his mother humiliate me in one of the most expensive restaurants in New York City. He wanted me small, compliant, and grateful for the scraps his family threw at me. I took a deep breath, picked up my black pen, and prepared to sign. Before the tip of my pen could even touch the crisp paper, a heavy hand slammed flat onto the table, making the crystal water glasses rattle. I looked up. It was Kendrick, my soon-to-be brother-in-law. He was married to David's sister, Natalie, and he never missed an opportunity to remind everyone in the room that he was a senior wealth manager at a boutique firm. Tonight he was dressed in a flashy charcoal Tom Ford suit that practically screamed new money, complete with a diamond tie clip that caught the restaurant lighting a little too aggressively. "Hold on," Beatrice Kendrick said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Do not let her sign anything yet. A signature is just ink. We need full transparency before we officially welcome her into the fold. For all we know, she is sitting on massive credit card debt and planning to use David as her personal bailout plan." I set the pen down slowly. "Excuse me, Kendrick," I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Kendrick let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. "Look, Clara, do not take it personally. It is just basic risk assessment. You work an admin job. You do not come from a family with a portfolio. We have to be careful. You are marrying into a legacy. You are sitting at a table with people who move millions before breakfast. And honestly, no offense, but look at you." He gestured vaguely at my outfit with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You showed up to Le Bernardin in a completely unbranded plain fabric dress. You do not even own a decent handbag. My tie probably costs more than your entire wardrobe. We cannot have you draining David's accounts just so you can finally buy yourself something with a designer label." I looked back down at my dress. It was a bespoke Loro Piana cashmere and silk blend that I had flown to Milan to be fitted for. True luxury does not need a flashy logo to announce its value, but a man like Kendrick would never understand that. Let him think I was wearing a cheap knockoff. It played perfectly into my hands. "I am not after David's money," I said, maintaining my posture. "I have never asked him for a single dime." "Words are cheap," Clara Kendrick snapped back, leaning over the table, invading my personal space. "If you have nothing to hide, prove it right now. Take out your phone, open your banking app. I want to see your checking account balance, your savings, and I want you to pull up your FICO credit score right here in front of all of us. If you are clean, then you can sign the prenup. If you refuse, then we know exactly what kind of gold digger we are dealing with." The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the air. This was not just about a prenuptial agreement anymore. This was a calculated, coordinated humiliation tactic. It was blatant financial abuse. They were trying to strip me of every ounce of my dignity, establishing a dynamic where they would control every financial aspect of my marriage. They wanted me to feel small, desperate, and entirely at their mercy. I glanced at Natalie, David's sister. She was sipping her champagne, watching the interrogation with a look of immense satisfaction. To her, this was just an entertaining dinner show. Kendrick tapped his expensive watch. "We are waiting, Clara. Open the app. Or do you need me to log in for you? I deal with low-net-worth individuals all the time. I know it can be embarrassing to show a zero balance, but this is a prerequisite for joining this family." My phone was sitting right next to my plate. If I unlocked it and opened my main banking app, Kendrick would see a checking account with over $8 million in liquid cash. He would see that my credit score was a flawless 850. He would see that the wealth management firm he worked for was actually renting office space in a commercial building that my company owned. But revealing my cards now would ruin the trap I was carefully constructing. I had to play the victim a little longer. I reached for my phone with a trembling hand, faking a look of deep shame. "Please, Kendrick," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound shaky. "This is really invasive. Can we just keep this between David and me? I am happy to sign the paperwork, but showing my personal bank accounts at a dinner table feels entirely inappropriate." Kendrick slammed his hand down on the table once more, his eyes flashing with aggressive arrogance. "It is not inappropriate. It is mandatory. Open the app, Clara. Right now." I slowly pulled my hands back from the table edge and turned my gaze toward David. This was his moment. The man who had proposed to me under the blooming cherry blossoms in Central Park, promising to always be my equal partner, was sitting right next to me, while his brother-in-law treated me like a common criminal. I waited for him to speak up. I waited for him to tell Kendrick to back off, to remind his mother that we were supposed to be celebrating our future together. Instead, David let out a long, theatrical sigh, as if my reluctance was a massive burden on his shoulders. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his designer suit jacket, and reached over to pat my hand. His grip was slightly too tight, a silent warning rather than a comforting gesture. "Come on, babe," he said, his voice dripping with thick condescension. "Kendrick knows finance. He is just doing his job and making sure all the bases are covered. You are making this a much bigger deal than it needs to be." I stared at him, genuinely stunned by the casual betrayal. "I am making it a big deal, David. He is demanding to see my private bank accounts in the middle of a crowded restaurant. He just called me a gold digger to my face." David rolled his eyes, looking around the room, as if embarrassed by my volume, even though I was speaking softly. "My family has a legacy to protect, Clara. We have a board of directors, aggressive shareholders, and media optics to worry about. We cannot afford any loose ends. If you love me, just sign it and show him the app. It takes 2 seconds. Why are you being so difficult and defensive?" The sheer hypocrisy of his words tasted like sour ash in my mouth. For 2 years, I had played the role of the supportive low-income girlfriend perfectly. I had let him split the bill at cheap diners while he claimed his wealth was tied up. I had listened to him complain about the heavy burden of being a corporate heir. But this was too much. "A legacy to protect," I repeated, letting the words hang heavily in the air between us. I leaned in slightly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "Is that the same ironclad legacy that required you to borrow $7,000 from my emergency savings account last November? You know, the money I gave you to stop the dealership from repossessing your luxury Porsche because you had missed 3 payments in a row." The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware against fine china seemed to stop entirely. Beatrice froze with her crystal wineglass halfway to her lips, her eyes widening in horror. Natalie abruptly stopped her arrogant smirking and sat up straight. Kendrick blinked rapidly, looking between David and me in sudden, sharp confusion. David's face turned a violent, blotchy shade of red. "Clara, what the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed, his charming facade completely dissolving. "Why would you bring that up right now? That was a strictly private matter between us. You are the one demanding absolute financial transparency." "David," I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact, "I am just trying to understand the rules of this table. Because when you were sitting on the worn-out sofa in my cramped apartment, practically crying and begging me for cash because your trust fund allowance was supposedly frozen in a venture capital escrow dispute, you did not seem too worried about the mighty family legacy. You just wanted my money so you could keep up appearances at your country club." Beatrice slammed her glass down on the table, spilling a drop of red wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. "How dare you speak to my son that way?" She snapped, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "David merely had a temporary cash flow issue. High net worth individuals often have their capital tied up in illiquid assets. A girl from your background would not possibly understand how real wealth operates." "Exactly," Kendrick chimed in quickly, recovering his arrogant posture and adjusting his expensive tie. "Liquidity management is highly complex. Do not try to equate your little rainy day savings account with advanced corporate finance. Now stop deflecting from the issue at hand and open the app." David glared at me, his eyes cold and suddenly very distant. The love I thought I had seen in them yesterday was completely gone. "I paid you back, did I not?" he snapped defensively. Yes, he had paid me back 3 months later, but I knew exactly where that money had come from. My own firm, Aegis Capital, had unknowingly approved a high-interest short-term corporate loan for his family's failing subsidiary just days before he handed me that repayment check. He was drowning in hidden debt, living a champagne lifestyle on a tap water budget, and using me as his financial safety net, while simultaneously letting his family treat me like garbage. I looked at the 4 of them, Beatrice with her false superiority, Kendrick with his hollow financial jargon, Natalie radiating entitled cruelty, and David the weak, pathetic man who was perfectly willing to throw me to the wolves just to hide his own bankrupt reality from his family. This ambush was never about protecting their immense wealth. This was about asserting total control over me, ensuring I would feel too insignificant to ever question their grand facade. David pushed the heavy prenuptial agreement closer to my plate, tapping the signature line with his index finger aggressively. I am not going to ask you again, Clara. Stop embarrassing us. Open your phone for Kendrick and sign the document right now. If you want to be a part of this family, you play by our rules. I stared at his aggressively tapping finger, then up at his cold, impatient eyes. The air in the restaurant felt thick, suffocating. I realized then that no amount of logic or hurt feelings would penetrate their bubble of arrogance. They did not want a partner for David, they wanted a subordinate. And if I fought them now, I would blow my cover and lose the opportunity to completely dismantle their operation. So I did what they expected. I broke, or at least I made them think I did. I let my shoulders slump. I dropped my gaze to the pristine white tablecloth staring at the heavy stack of paper. I took a slow, shaky breath, channeling every ounce of vulnerability I could muster. Okay, I whispered, making my voice sound defeated and small. You are right. I am sorry for causing a scene. I just got defensive because I was intimidated. Please do not be angry. David immediately relaxed, leaning back in his chair with a smug smirk. He looked at his mother as if to say, I told you I had her under control. Beatrice gave a curt nod of approval, taking another delicate sip of her wine. Kendrick clapped his hands together, a sharp sound that echoed slightly. Good girl, he said condescendingly. Now the phone. Let us get this over with so we can actually order our entrees. I picked up my phone with trembling hands. I opened my banking app, but instead of logging into my primary Aegis Capital private vault, I opened an old secondary checking account I kept active for minor subscription renewals. It had a balance of exactly $2,415. I slid the phone across the table toward Kendrick. He picked it up, adjusting his suit jacket, and stared at the screen. He let out a loud, mocking snort. $2,000, he laughed, showing the screen to Natalie, who giggled behind her hand. $2,000 to your name at 33 years old. My watch strap cost more than your entire net worth, Clara. It is honestly a miracle you even survive in New York. You should be on your knees thanking David for pulling you out of whatever bleak future you were heading toward. I kept my head down, playing the humiliated fiancé perfectly, letting them enjoy their false victory. Are we satisfied now? David asked his brother-in-law, clearly eager to move past the awkwardness now that his dominance was established. Kendrick tossed my phone back onto the table. Yeah, we are good. The risk profile is low because there is literally nothing to risk. Give her a pen. I reached my hand out slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the white tablecloth. Kendrick unclipped a sleek, heavy Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket and handed it to me with a flourish. Make sure you press hard, he instructed. We need the carbon copies to be legible. I pulled the 50-page prenuptial agreement toward me. I did not flip straight to the back page. Instead, I methodically turned the pages, pretending to skim the dense legal jargon, while my heart pounded a steady, cold rhythm in my chest. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Before this dinner, when Beatrice had emailed me a digital draft of this document, claiming it was a standard template, I had forwarded it to my lead corporate attorney. He had inserted a tiny hyper-specific addendum buried deep in the text. I reached page 42. I casually adjusted my posture, leaning my left arm on the table to slightly shield the document from Kendrick's line of sight. Hidden beneath a paragraph about intellectual property forfeiture, there was a single sentence referencing a cross-liability waiver under New York State corporate law. It essentially stated that upon signing, the groom's family completely indemnified the bride against any pre-existing or future debts and formally waived their right to contest any financial actions she took against their corporate entities. I quickly pressed the Mont Blanc pen to the paper and scrawled my initials right next to that lethal sentence. I then flipped to the final page, took a deep breath, and signed my full name on the dotted line. Before I could even put the cap back on the pen, Kendrick reached across the table and snatched the heavy stack of papers right out from under my hands. He did not bother to flip through it. He did not check my initials. He just confidently tapped the edges of the paper against the table to straighten them, incredibly arrogant and utterly blind to the reality of what just happened. He slipped the document into his leather briefcase and snapped the locks shut. The metallic click of the brass locks echoed like a heavy steel vault door slamming shut. Only I was not the one locked inside. "Welcome to the family, Clara." Beatrice sneered, raising her glass in a mocking toast. "Try to keep up." Natalie smirked, finally picking up her menu, completely dismissing my existence. I picked up my water glass, hiding a sharp, genuine smile behind the crystal rim. They thought they had just secured their legacy by trapping a poor, naive girl. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the legal authority to destroy their entire empire. The ride back to my apartment was agonizingly quiet for the first 10 minutes. The heavy doors of Le Bernardin had closed behind us, and David immediately shed his stern, commanding persona, slipping comfortably back into the role of the charming, affectionate boyfriend. As the valet brought his Porsche around the very same car I had secretly saved from repossession, he wrapped an arm around my waist and kissed the top of my head. He acted as if his family had not just spent the last 2 hours dissecting my worth and treating me like a street urchin. Inside the car, the heated leather seats offered a stark contrast to the chill in my bones. David reached over, taking my right hand and rubbing his thumb over my knuckles. "I am really proud of you, Clara," he said softly, keeping his eyes on the road. "You were such a good sport in there. I know my mother can be intense and Kendrick lacks a certain tact, but you handled it perfectly. Now they know you are truly committed to us. It was just a hurdle we had to clear." A hurdle. That was what he called a coordinated psychological attack. I kept my face turned toward the passenger side window, watching the neon lights of the Manhattan skyline blur past. "I am just glad it is over," I replied, keeping my tone submissive and slightly breathless. "Well, the hard part is over," David chuckled, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. "But now that you are officially in the family trust circle, we need to talk about logistics. Natalie is finalizing the details for her destination wedding in Lake Como next month. She expects all the bridesmaids to be there for a full 2 weeks for the pre-wedding events, the yacht parties, and the rehearsal dinners." I turned to look at him. 2 weeks in Italy. David, I only get a few days of paid time off from my admin job, and I cannot possibly afford a 2-week stay at a luxury resort in Lake Como. David sighed, an exaggerated sound of exhaustion that he always used when he was about to manipulate me. "Babe, we talked about this. You have to make sacrifices if you want to fit in with my family. Talk to your boss, take unpaid leave if you have to. This is Natalie's big day. If you do not show up, my mother will never forgive you." "But the flights alone will be thousands of dollars," I protested gently, playing into the trap. "Are you going to help me cover the travel costs?" David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching slightly. "Clara, be reasonable. My family's capital is completely tied up in a massive commercial real estate venture right now. Our assets are entirely illiquid until the end of the quarter. I cannot just pull cash out of my trust fund to buy you plane tickets. It would look terrible to the board." He paused, glancing at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Besides, you just showed Kendrick your banking app. You have fantastic credit. Why do you not just go down to the bank on Monday and take out a small personal loan? 10 or 15,000 should cover your flights, your hotel room, and the designer dresses my mother expects you to wear. It is an investment in our future, Clara. You need to prove you are a team player." The sheer audacity of his request was almost mesmerizing. Less than an hour ago, he had watched his mother force me to sign a legal document ensuring I would leave a divorce with nothing. Now he was casually demanding I go into debt to fund his sister's vanity project, all while hiding behind the lie of an illiquid trust fund. He was broke and he wanted me to finance his family's facade. "Okay," I whispered, looking down at my hands. "I will go to the bank on Monday and see what kind of personal loan I can get." "That is my girl," David said, entirely satisfied. 20 minutes later, he pulled up to the curb outside the modest brick apartment building in Queens that I rented specifically to maintain my cover. He did not turn off the engine. He just leaned over, kissed me deeply, and told me he loved me. I smiled, stepped out into the cold night air, and closed the heavy car door. I stood on the sidewalk, and watched the red taillights of his Porsche disappear around the corner. The second the car was out of sight, my timid posture vanished. I stood up straight, the cold night air suddenly feeling incredibly refreshing. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I bypassed the dummy banking app and opened my encrypted contact list, dialing my chief legal officer at Aegis Capital. He answered on the second ring. "Did you get the high-resolution scan from the hidden camera in my brooch?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, replacing the helpless girlfriend tone with the sharp edge of a CEO. "Yes, Clara." His voice crackled through the speaker, crisp and professional. "The image quality is perfect. We have your signature, and more importantly, we have a clear shot of your initials next to the cross-liability waiver." "Is it ironclad?" I asked, walking past the entrance of my fake apartment building and heading toward the black SUV that my private driver had parked half a block away. "Absolutely ironclad," he confirmed. "Under New York State corporate law, Kendrick and Beatrice just legally indemnified you against all of their corporate liabilities, and they waived their right to contest any debt restructuring you enforce upon them. They locked themselves in the cage and handed you the only key." "Perfect," I said, sliding into the back seat of my waiting car. "Let them enjoy their weekend. Come Monday, we start tightening the leash." The following Sunday, the illusion of family bonding continued at Beatrice's sprawling estate in the Hamptons for a late morning brunch. The sun was pouring through the massive glass windows of the conservatory, illuminating the extravagant spread of imported pastries, smoked salmon, and bottomless mimosas. I sat quietly next to David, sipping my black coffee, observing the performative display of wealth. I knew for a fact that the mortgage on this very estate was 3 months past due, a piece of toxic debt currently sitting in my firm's acquisition pipeline. But looking at Beatrice, draped in a silk robe and dripping in pearls, you would think she owned half the eastern seaboard. Natalie sat across from me, aggressively tapping her manicured fingers against the screen of her latest tablet. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, clearly meant to draw the attention of the entire table. "The logistics for Lake Como are becoming an absolute nightmare," Natalie announced, sliding the tablet to the center of the table. "I have the bridal party sorted, but the travel coordinator just sent over the flight invoices. Flying 8 bridesmaids first class to Milan is pulling too much liquidity from my wedding budget. I need someone to sponsor the flights." She did not look at her mother. She did not look at her brother. She locked her sharp blue eyes directly onto me. "Clara, since you are officially part of the family now, I think this is the perfect opportunity for you to step up," Natalie said, her tone leaving absolutely no room for discussion. "Consider it your contribution to the wedding. It is the least you can do to blend into the family properly." I carefully set my coffee cup down on the saucer. The porcelain clinked softly in the quiet room. Sponsoring 8 first-class international flights would cost upwards of $60,000. "Natalie," I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm, "I cannot afford to pay for 8 first-class tickets to Italy. That is an enormous expense." David shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Babe, we talked about this in the car," he muttered under his breath, leaning in close so only I could hear. "You said you were going to the bank for a personal loan." "I did go to the bank," I replied smoothly, looking right at him. "And the loan officer told me that taking out $60,000 for someone else's vacation flights is financial suicide for an administrative assistant. I cannot do it." Natalie slammed her palm down on the table, making the silver forks jump. "It is not a vacation, Clara. It is my wedding. And you are not paying for someone else, you are paying for the bridal party. You should be honored I am even letting you be in the official photos. I am trying to include you, but you are making it incredibly difficult with this constant poverty mindset." Beatrice stirred her tea, not even bothering to look up from her cup. "Natalie is right, Clara. You have to understand that marrying David means elevating your lifestyle. We operate on a completely different level of society. If you cannot even manage a simple travel expense, how are you going to handle the charity galas and the country club fees? You need to stop acting like a wage worker." I kept my composure, refusing to let their bait pull me out of character. I am sorry, but the answer is no. I can cover my own economy ticket, but I will not be financing the rest of the bridal party. Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes narrowing with undisguised contempt. Well, I suppose we should not expect much more from your bloodline. Tell me, Clara, do your parents even own passports? Thomas? And Helen? Wasn't it? What do they do again? Public school teaching? Middle management? I shudder to think of them trying to navigate a European luxury airport. They would probably show up to the rehearsal dinner in cheap denim. Honestly, it is a blessing they cannot afford to come. We will not have to hide them from our high-profile clients. My blood ran cold. Insulting me was one thing, but dragging my parents into their delusional superiority complex was crossing a dangerous line. Thomas and Helen were quiet, humble people who spent their billions funding clean water initiatives and building pediatric hospitals, actively avoiding the disgusting flaunting of wealth that Beatrice lived for. My parents are perfectly fine, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing a fraction of the helpless facade. And they will not be attending because they have better things to do than watch people pretend to be something they are not. Furthermore, my answer remains no, Natalie. I am not buying those tickets. Natalie let out a piercing shriek of frustration, pushing her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the marble floor. You are ruining everything, she screamed, her face turning crimson. You are ruining my perfect week. You are so incredibly selfish and cheap. She grabbed her tablet and stormed out of the conservatory, her heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Beatrice glared at me as if I had just committed a violent crime. David stood up, running a hand through his hair in a panic. Look what you did, Clara. Can you not just be flexible for once in your life? You are embarrassing me in front of my own family. Fix this, or do not bother coming over next week. He turned and chased after his sister, leaving me alone at the table with Beatrice. She took a slow sip of her mimosa, smirking at me over the rim of the crystal glass. I did not break eye contact. I just picked up my black coffee, took a sip, and smiled inwardly. Let them throw their tantrums. The trap was already set. Before Beatrice could deliver another barbed comment, the heavy wooden doors of the conservatory swung open. David marched back into the room, his face pale and his jaw tightly clenched. He did not sit down. Instead, he walked straight over to my chair, grabbed my arm with a grip that was far too tight, and pulled me to my feet. We need to talk, he muttered sharply. Right now. He practically dragged me out of the sunlit room and down the long mahogany-paneled hallway, pushing me into a quiet, dusty study. He slammed the door shut behind us and rounded on me, his eyes wide with a desperate energy. Are you out of your mind? He hissed aggressively, keeping his voice low so the estate staff would not hear. You just humiliated my sister in front of our mother. You are making us look poor, Clara. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is right now? I rubbed my arm where he had grabbed me, maintaining my calm expression. Dangerous. David, it is just airplane tickets. I am a secretary. It is completely normal that I cannot drop $60,000 on luxury travel. Nobody is going to think your family is poor just because I am. David ran both hands through his hair, ruining the expensive blowout. He paced across the Persian rug, breathing heavily. You do not understand, he said, his voice cracking slightly. The mask of the confident air was slipping, revealing the terrified, bankrupt man underneath. The flights are just a symptom, Clara. Natalie needs the optics of a flawless wedding because we need our investors to think everything is perfectly fine. But it is not. We are drowning. I widened my eyes, playing the shocked girlfriend. What do you mean you are drowning? I thought the family capital was just tied up in commercial real estate. David let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking his head. That is what we tell the country club. That is what we tell the board. But the truth is much worse. Kendrick is in deep trouble. He overleveraged a massive portfolio at his wealth management firm. The market dipped last week, and he got hit with a catastrophic margin call. I knew exactly what a margin call was, but I made sure to look appropriately confused and worried. A margin call. Is that bad? It is a death sentence, David said, stepping closer to me. Kendrick used our family company's remaining liquid assets to secretly back his trades. If he does not inject $200,000 into his firm's clearing account by this Friday, the brokerage will liquidate his positions. He will be investigated for fraud, he will lose his license, and our business will be seized to cover the collateral deficit. We will lose everything. This house, the cars, the company, all of it. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer audacity of his words wash over me. The condescending wealth manager who had mocked my unbranded dress and demanded to see my bank account at Le Bernardin was a complete fraud. The entire family was a fragile house of cards running purely on debt pretension and other people's money. And now, the mighty heirs were standing in a dark room begging the working-class girl to save them from total ruin. "That is terrible, David," I whispered. "But what does that have to do with me?" David grabbed my shoulders, staring intensely into my eyes. "I saw your banking app the other night. You have a flawless credit score. You have absolutely zero debt. You are a ghost to the major lenders, which means you are the perfect candidate for a high-yield private loan." I stepped back, pulling out of his desperate grasp. "You want me to take out a loan for Kendrick?" "Not for Kendrick, for us." David pleaded, his voice dripping with manipulation. "I need you to go to a private tier lender and borrow $200,000. Just sign the paperwork, get the cash, and transfer it to Kendrick's firm. I promise you, Clara, my trust fund unlocks at the end of next month. I will pay you back the second the funds clear plus interest. I will even buy you that wedding ticket. But I need you to do this for me right now." He was asking me to ruin my financial future to plug a hole in his sinking ship. He was fully prepared to let me take the fall if his imaginary trust fund never materialized. It was the most despicable request I had ever heard. But it was also the exact opportunity I had been waiting for. The perfect mechanism to completely destroy them. $200,000, I repeated, letting my voice shake just enough to convey utter disbelief. I wrapped my arms around myself, stepping back from him as if the number itself carried a physical weight. "David, I am an administrative assistant. No traditional bank is going to approve an unsecured personal loan of that magnitude for me. My credit score is excellent, but my declared income on paper is nowhere near high enough to justify that kind of risk to a commercial lender. They would laugh me out of the branch." David groaned, rubbing his temples frantically. He began pacing the small study again, his panic rising. "You have to try, Clara. Go to multiple banks if you have to. Lie on the application. Tell them your family is backing it. Do something. If that money does not hit Kendrick's clearing account by Friday morning, the entire illusion shatters. The authorities will look into the family ledgers." I watched him unravel. The polished, arrogant air was completely gone, replaced by a desperate con artist terrified of being caught. "Lie on a federal loan application?" I asked, widening my eyes in mock horror. "David, that is fraud. I could go to prison. I cannot do that." He stopped pacing and rushed back over to me, grabbing my hands. His palms were clammy. He was sweating despite the cool temperature of the room. "Clara, please. You are the only person outside of the immediate family who knows about this. If we go to our country club friends, the rumor mill will destroy our stock value before the margin call even hits. You are our only lifeline. I will marry you. We will have the perfect life. Just help me survive this week." I let a heavy, dramatic silence hang between us. I looked down at our joined hands, biting my lower lip, as if wrestling with a massive moral dilemma. "There might be another way," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with desperate hope. "What? What is it? Tell me." When I lived in the city before we met, I had a friend. I began carefully fabricating the narrative. He works in private equity and high-yield bridge lending. He deals with alternative financing, the kind of loans that do not require traditional income verification, but rely heavily on spotless credit profiles and immediate hard collateral. David exhaled a massive breath of relief, squeezing my hand so tightly it actually hurt. Yes, that is exactly what we need. A private lender. They move fast. Call him Clara. Call him right now. I pulled my hands away, gently shaking my head with feigned worry. David, you do not understand. These are not friendly loans. My friend operates a legitimate corporate firm, but their terms are incredibly aggressive. If they lend this kind of money, they require a watertight contract. They will charge predatory interest, and they will absolutely demand corporate collateral. They will not just hand me $200,000 on a promise. If you and Kendrick default, this lender will legally dismantle whatever collateral you put up. I do not care about the terms, David said, instantly, completely dismissing my warnings. The interest rate does not matter. I told you my trust fund unlocks at the end of next month. I will have millions in liquid cash. We will pay your friend back in 30 days. Let him put whatever terrifying clauses he wants into the contract. It is just a temporary bridge. We just need the cash by Friday. Are you absolutely sure? I asked, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. I do not want to be responsible if something goes wrong. Kendrick would have to sign the promissory note, and he would have to use the family company as the backing asset. My friend will not accept anything less. David waved his hand dismissively, entirely blind to the financial guillotine he was walking into. Kendrick will sign whatever you put in front of him. He is the one who caused this mess. Just get the paperwork drawn up. Tell your friend we agreed to the terms sight unseen. Just get the money wired. I let out a shaky breath, nodding slowly. Okay. I will make the call as soon as we leave here today. But you have to promise me, David. You have to promise me that you will pay it back. I promise on my life, Clara, he said, pulling me into a tight, desperate hug. You are saving my family. I will never forget this. You are amazing. Over his shoulder, I stared blankly at the wall of dusty books in the study. My heart was completely steady. He had just given me verbal authorization to draft the most lethal corporate loan agreement possible. He was so panicked by the immediate threat of Kendrick's margin call that he did not bother to ask for the name of the lending firm, the specific interest rate, or the exact legal structure of the collateral agreement. He thought I was calling a shady friend to beg for a favor. He had no idea that I was going to call my own chief financial officer. I was not just going to hand them a lifeline. I was going to become the primary creditor of their entire fraudulent empire. Monday morning arrived with a sharp chill in the air. Instead of taking the subway to the fabricated administrative job my fiancé believed I had, my private driver dropped me off at the underground parking garage of a sleek glass skyscraper in the financial district. I took the secure elevator straight to the top floor. The heavy steel doors slid open to reveal the polished marble lobby of Aegis Capital, the billion-dollar venture fund I had built from the ground up. My chief financial officer, Harrison, was already waiting for me in my corner office. Spread across my massive mahogany desk was the blueprint for Kendrick's financial execution. Harrison did not ask questions about my personal life. He only executed my strategies with lethal corporate precision. He handed me a thick leather-bound folder containing the draft. I sat down in my executive chair and reviewed the documents. We were structuring this as a senior secured convertible note. To the average person, that sounds like standard financial jargon. In reality, it is a corporate bear trap. The premise was deceptively simple. Aegis Capital, operating through a quiet subsidiary shell company, would front the $200,000 to satisfy the margin call, threatening Kendrick's wealth management firm. The interest rate was set at an aggressive but legally permissible 29% annualized, which is entirely typical for high-risk, distressed bridge loans. But the interest rate was just a distraction. The true venom was buried deep in the collateral clause. Kendrick needed the money instantly, meaning he had absolutely zero leverage to negotiate. Because he had unlawfully used David's family company Crestview Enterprises to back his failing portfolio, Crestview had to be the guarantor of this new loan. The contract stipulated that if the principal amount and all accrued interest were not paid in full within exactly 30 days, the debt would immediately default. Upon default, the entire outstanding balance would automatically convert into a 100% equity stake in Crestview Enterprises. It was a mechanism for absolute corporate seizure. Is this completely airtight under these specific circumstances? I asked Harrison, running my finger down the dense paragraphs of legal text. Harrison nodded, adjusting his glasses. It is entirely binding and perfectly legal. We are lending to Kendrick's firm as a corporate entity backed by David's family holding company. We require both Kendrick's signature as the primary borrower and David's signature as the chief operating officer guaranteeing the collateral. Since they are desperate to beat the Friday margin call deadline, they will sign it immediately without passing it through a competent legal review. They are too arrogant and too panicked to read the fine print. And the prenuptial agreement I pressed, wanting to be absolutely certain the trap could not be untangled in a messy family court battle later. Harrison smiled, a rare break in his strictly professional demeanor. That is the genius of the addendum you forced them to initial at the restaurant last week. By signing that cross-liability waiver under New York state law, Beatrice and David legally indemnified you from their corporate debts. More importantly, they explicitly waived their right to contest any financial actions you or any corporate entity you control take against them. They cannot claim conflict of interest. They cannot sue you for predatory lending or bad faith. They literally signed away their right to defend themselves against Aegis Capital. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline. The pieces were locking into place perfectly. David thought he was using my spotless credit to borrow money from a nameless private equity friend. He was right about the private equity part. He just did not realize I owned the firm, and I was using his own reckless greed to acquire his entire family legacy for the price of a modest sports car. He was relying on a fictional trust fund to pay me back in 30 days, a trust fund my analysts had already confirmed did not exist. Package the contract under the subsidiary name, I instructed Harrison, keeping my voice cold and steady. Send it to David's personal email from a generic administrative address. Tell him the funds are ready for immediate wire transfer upon receipt of the digital signatures. Do not give them a single second to think. The artificial pressure of their own impending bankruptcy will do all the heavy lifting for us. Harrison gathered the documents, placing them carefully back into the folder. Consider it done, Clara. The wire is primed. Once they sign, the 30-day countdown begins. If they do not have the liquidity to pay us back, Aegis Capital will own Crestview Enterprises by the end of next month. I turned my chair back to my desk, picking up a gold pen. Send it, I said softly. Let them hang themselves. I did not leave my office after Harrison walked out. I stayed seated at my massive mahogany desk, watching my private terminal screen. A secure tracking link showed that the digital contract had been successfully delivered to David's personal inbox. The sender name simply read, Apex Financial Services, a sterile, forgettable subsidiary of Aegis Capital. I watched the timestamp on the screen. It took exactly 4 minutes for the document to be opened. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands. Would they actually read it? Would David consult a real lawyer? Would Kendrick, the self-proclaimed financial genius, recognize the lethal convertible equity clause buried in page 6? The answer came 12 minutes later. A green notification flashed across my monitor. All required signatures had been digitally captured and verified. David had signed as the guarantor, and Kendrick had signed as the primary borrower. They had not spent even a fraction of the time necessary to read the terms and conditions. Their panic over the Friday margin call had completely blinded them to the corporate bear trap they had just eagerly stepped into. I picked up my secure office phone and dialed Harrison's direct extension. The signatures are verified, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. Release the funds. Within seconds, $200,000 vanished from one of my corporate shell accounts and began its journey through the federal wire system, directly into Kendrick's failing brokerage clearing account. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their family legacy was officially averted, but only temporarily. They had traded a fast, messy execution for a slow, meticulously planned corporate slaughter. I logged out of my terminal, grabbed my coat, and took the private elevator down to my waiting car. For the rest of the week, I played the role of the anxious, devoted fiancé flawlessly. I answered David's calls with a soft, worried tone, asking if the money had arrived in time and if his brother-in-law was okay. He assured me everything was fine, his voice thick with the arrogant relief of a man who believes he has outsmarted the universe. He even had the nerve to suggest that my mysterious friend in finance was lucky to do business with such a prestigious family. I simply agreed with him, letting him talk in circles about how brilliant his crisis management skills were. By Friday evening, the reality of their survival had clearly gone straight to Kendrick's head. I was sitting on the sofa in my modest Queens apartment sipping a glass of inexpensive wine to stay in character when a notification popped up on my phone. It was Instagram. Kendrick had just posted a new picture to his public feed. I clicked on it and let out a sharp, cold laugh. The photo showed Kendrick sitting at the steering wheel of his Range Rover, his wrist angled perfectly to catch the sunlight. Clasped around his wrist was a brand new solid gold Rolex Daytona. The caption below it read, "Market moves, always liquid, never bet against the house." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Less than 48 hours after begging for a massive private bailout to save himself from federal fraud charges, he had taken a portion of that very loan and bought a luxury watch to maintain his wealthy facade on social media. I immediately took a screenshot of the post and backed it up to my secure cloud server. It was a beautiful piece of evidence showing gross financial mismanagement and misappropriation of corporate funds. Just as I saved the image, my phone vibrated with an incoming text message from David. "Hey babe," he wrote. "Just wanted to say thank you again. The funds cleared perfectly. Kendrick sorted out his little liquidity issue, and the family board is thrilled. You really stepped up. Thanks for being such a team player. Love you." I stared at the glowing screen, marveling at the profound depth of his ignorance. He thought I was a team player. He thought his family was safe. He had absolutely no idea that the money he just praised me for securing was the exact weapon I would use to take everything he owned. I typed a brief reply. "Anything for family. I am just glad it is handled." I hit send and tossed the heavy phone onto the soft cushion right beside me. I looked at the calendar hanging on my kitchen wall. The digital ink on their new contract was dry. The money was spent. There was no going back now. The invisible 30-day countdown had officially begun. In exactly 1 month, the note would mature. They would not have the cash to repay me. The default clause would trigger, and Crestview Enterprises would belong entirely and completely to me. 4 weeks passed in a blur of forced smiles and calculated silence. We were now officially 28 days into the 30-day loan period. Kendrick had not made a single payment toward the interest, let alone the principal. Instead, he and David were too busy organizing an extravagantly lavish engagement celebration to notice the financial guillotine suspended directly above their necks. The party was hosted at the Oakwood Valley Country Club, an exclusive members-only estate known for astronomical initiation fees and strict dress codes. It was exactly the kind of place Beatrice loved to use as a weapon. I stood near the grand staircase in the main ballroom, holding a flute of sparkling water, watching the display of borrowed wealth. A live string quartet played softly in the corner, partially obscured by a massive ice sculpture of 2 swans. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated with trays of imported caviar and champagne. David was across the room, laughing loudly, with a group of investors playing the role of the successful corporate heir perfectly. I checked my phone. My parents were due to arrive any minute. I had explicitly asked Thomas and Helen to wear their most modest, unbranded clothing. They were billionaires who spent most of their time in comfortable cashmere and tailored cotton, completely devoid of flashy logos. To the untrained eye, they looked like retired schoolteachers. To anyone who understood stealth wealth, their garments were masterpieces of quiet luxury. Through the massive glass doors of the foyer, I saw them step out of a sleek, unmarked black sedan. My mother wore a simple navy shift dress, and my father wore a gray linen suit without a tie. They looked elegant, comfortable, and entirely out of place among the sea of sequins rhinestones and oversized designer belts that David's family favored. I started walking toward the entrance to greet them, but Beatrice beat me to it. She intercepted my parents right as they stepped onto the marble floor of the foyer. Beatrice was wearing a floor-length emerald gown dripping with beads, a massive diamond choker tight around her neck. I slowed my pace, staying just out of sight behind a marble pillar so I could hear the interaction. I needed to see exactly how far she would go. "You must be Clara's parents," Beatrice said loudly, not bothering to extend her hand for a greeting. Her voice echoed slightly in the grand entryway, drawing the attention of a few nearby guests. She looked my mother and father up and down her face, twisting into a tight, exaggerated smile of pity. "Thomas and Helen, I am Beatrice David's mother. We were beginning to wonder if you were going to make it." "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Beatrice," my father said warmly, offering his hand. Beatrice stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment before giving it a brief limp shake. "Yes, quite," she replied dryly, immediately pulling a small bottle of hand sanitizer from her jeweled clutch and applying a drop to her palms. "Did you have trouble finding the place?" The security gates can be quite intimidating for people who are not used to this sort of environment. I told the guards to look out for a rideshare or perhaps a city taxi. "Did you take the bus from Queens? I understand public transit can be so unreliable on the weekends." My mother let out a soft, polite laugh, completely unbothered. "We arranged our own transportation, thank you for checking. The grounds here are certainly expansive." Beatrice sighed dramatically, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace. "Expansive and exclusive. We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain standard. To be perfectly honest, I was a bit concerned about what you might wear tonight. Clara is such a sweet, simple girl, and she clearly gets her modest sensibilities from you two. I am glad you managed to find something clean to put on, even if it is a bit informal for a black tie optional event." My father smiled gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He knew the gray linen suit he was wearing cost more than Beatrice's entire jewelry collection. "We prefer comfort, Beatrice. But thank you for hosting us." "Oh, do not thank me yet," Beatrice said, her tone dripping with venom disguised as hospitality. "I have spoken to the catering director. I know rich, heavily seasoned gourmet food can be quite harsh on stomachs that are used to a more basic diet. If the prime rib or the lobster bisque is too overwhelming for your systems, just wave down a waiter. I have instructed the kitchen to keep some plain chicken breast and boiled potatoes on standby for you. We do not want you getting sick in the middle of our high-profile celebration." I stood behind the pillar, my hands clenching into tight fists. The sheer cruelty of her words, the absolute arrogance she displayed while standing on the brink of total financial ruin, was staggering. She was actively trying to humiliate the people who had raised me, treating them like feral animals she was forced to accommodate. Thomas and Helen did not flinch. They simply thanked her for her consideration and asked where they should be seated. They were playing along, perfectly absorbing her insults with the quiet grace of people who possessed true, unshakable power. Beatrice pointed vaguely toward the back of the ballroom, dismissing them without another word as she turned to greet a wealthy local politician. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and stepped out from behind the pillar. The time for hiding in the shadows was rapidly coming to an end. I watched my parents navigate the crowded ballroom. The massive space was a sea of crystal chandeliers, towering floral centerpieces of white orchids, and tables draped in heavy silk. At the very front, elevated on a slight riser, sat the head table where David, Beatrice, and Kendrick were already taking their seats. It was adorned with silver candelabras and personalized gold nameplates. My parents walked past the first tier of tables, then the second. They kept walking. I trailed a few dozen feet behind them, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. They bypassed the tables occupied by David's extended relatives. They walked past the tables assigned to the junior partners of Kendrick's firm. They walked past the college friends, the neighbors, and the casual acquaintances. They reached the absolute edge of the dining floor, but there was no table with their names on it. The main carpeted area ended, giving way to the scuffed hardwood flooring that led toward the service corridors. And that was where Beatrice had placed them. Tucked into a dark, drafty corner directly next to the loud swinging metal doors of the kitchen was a small, round table. It did not have a silk tablecloth. It had a cheap standard-issue polyester cover with a visible coffee stain near the edge. There was no floral centerpiece, just a single flickering battery-operated tea light. But the most insulting part was not the location or the lack of decor. It was the fact that the table was already partially occupied. Two members of the waitstaff, a young busboy and a bartender, were sitting on the far side of it, eating their shift meals out of plastic containers. Beatrice had literally seated my parents, the people who brought me into this world, at the staff break table. A sharp metallic ringing sounded through the ballroom. I looked toward the front. David was standing at the head table, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The room began to quiet down as guests took their seats. The string quartet faded into silence. "Welcome, everyone." David's voice boomed through the microphone, echoing off the high ceilings. He flashed his perfect, expensive smile. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the merging of two families." I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the small table in the back. My father, a man who had built pediatric oncology wings in 3 different countries, was quietly pulling out a flimsy metal folding chair for my mother. He did not look angry. He just looked resigned, perfectly willing to endure this disrespect if it meant supporting me. Something inside me snapped. For 28 days, I had played the long game. I had allowed David to gaslight me. I had allowed Kendrick to insult my intelligence. I had allowed Beatrice to treat me like a stray dog she was reluctantly taking in. I had tolerated all of it because I knew the legal trap I had set would eventually wipe them out. I had kept my eyes on the big picture, telling myself that the ultimate corporate takeover would be the only revenge I needed. But seeing my parents relegated to the shadows, treated like an embarrassing afterthought by a family that was secretly bankrupt and drowning in my money, changed the equation completely. I realized that waiting 2 more days for the loan to default was no longer acceptable. The corporate execution was still going to happen. But I was not going to let them enjoy this party. I was not going to let them spend another hour pretending to be royalty while treating my family like peasants. The long game was over. It was time for immediate tactical strikes. David continued speaking at the front of the room, entirely oblivious to the storm gathering in the back. "As you all know, the Crestview legacy is built on strong partnerships and deep respect. Tonight we honor those traditions. We welcome Clara into a world of excellence, and we look forward to the future we are going to build together." The guests broke into polite applause. Beatrice raised her glass, beaming with false pride. I did not clap. I turned my back on the head table and walked purposefully toward the swinging kitchen doors. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. I reached the staff table just as my mother was sitting down. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder, stopping her. "Do not sit down, Mom," I said, my voice steady, but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed in mild concern. "Clara, sweetheart, it is fine. We do not mind sitting here. We are just happy to be here for you. Let us not cause a scene on your special night." My father nodded in agreement, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. "It is just a chair, Clara. Let David finish his speech." I looked from my parents to the 2 waitstaff members who had stopped eating and were watching us with wide, uncomfortable eyes. I gave them a small, apologetic smile before turning back to my parents. "No, Dad," I said, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "It is not just a chair, and this is not my special night. This is a charade, and we are done playing along. Pick up your coats. We are not sitting by the kitchen doors." I turned around, facing the massive, glittering ballroom. David was still holding the microphone, preparing to introduce his mother for the next toast. I took a deep breath, letting the final shreds of the naive, helpless fiancé persona fall away completely. I was Clara of Aegis Capital, and it was time to tear this entire fake empire to the ground. I started walking straight down the center aisle directly toward the head table. I marched down the aisle, my heels cutting sharply through the polite silence of the ballroom. I did not stop until I was standing directly in front of the elevated head table. David paused mid-sentence, the microphone still hovering near his mouth. He looked down at me, a confused, slightly irritated smile plastered on his face. He probably assumed I was so overwhelmed with gratitude that I wanted to say a few words. I did not wait for him to offer me the microphone. I reached out, picked up a heavy silver spoon from the table, and firmly tapped it against Kendrick's crystal water glass. The sharp, clear ring echoed loudly, commanding the entire room's attention. The remaining murmurs in the ballroom died instantly. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice projecting clearly without the aid of a microphone. It was not the soft, submissive tone I had used for the past 2 years. It was the voice I used in the boardroom when negotiations failed. Before we continue celebrating this supposed merging of families, we need to make a slight adjustment to the seating arrangement. David lowered the microphone, leaning over the edge of the table. "Babe, what are you doing?" he hissed through clenched teeth, his smile becoming strained. "This is not the time. Sit down." I ignored him completely. I turned my gaze toward the catering director, who was standing nervously near the kitchen doors. "You?" I called out, pointing directly at the director. "Please have your staff bring 2 chairs and 2 full-place settings to the head table immediately. My parents will be joining us up here." The ballroom was dead silent. The catering director froze, looking frantically between me and Beatrice for direction. Beatrice stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden riser. The emerald beads on her gown clicked together as she marched around the table to stand directly above me. Her face was flushed with sudden, aggressive anger. "What on earth do you think you are doing, Clara?" she demanded, her voice sharp and carrying perfectly across the silent room. "You do not give orders here. The seating chart was finalized weeks ago. Your parents are seated exactly where they belong. We do not have room for them at the head table." I looked up at her, meeting her furious glare with absolute chilling calm. "Make room, Beatrice, or I will have the staff remove 2 people to accommodate them." A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. Kendrick let out a loud, mocking laugh, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Who do you think you are talking to, Clara?" he sneered. "You are a guest here. You are barely that." Beatrice gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. She leaned down, dropping her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper that was still loud enough for the immediate tables to hear. "Listen to me very carefully, you little brat. This is the Oakwood Valley Country Club. It is an exclusive members-only establishment. I am a platinum member. I paid for this room. I dictated the seating. I will not have my carefully curated event ruined because you suddenly decided to develop a spine. Your parents stay by the kitchen, or they can leave. And if you say one more word, you can leave with them." I did not flinch. I did not lower my eyes. I just let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first genuine smile I had worn in weeks. "You paid for this room?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you absolutely sure about that, Beatrice? Because I am quite certain your membership dues have been suspended for non-payment for the last 4 months. Her jaw dropped. The color completely drained from her face. How dare you?" she sputtered, glancing frantically around the room to see who had heard. David was staring at me in absolute shock. Kendrick's arrogant smirk instantly vanished. "I am not asking you, Beatrice," I continued, my voice steady and commanding. "I am telling you. My parents are sitting at this table." I turned back to the catering director, who was still standing by the kitchen doors, looking absolutely terrified. I said, "Bring the chairs," I ordered, my tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Now." The director swallowed hard, clearly torn between the screaming wealthy matriarch on the stage and the woman standing on the floor, who somehow commanded more authority than anyone else in the room. Before the director could move, Beatrice slammed her hand on the table. "No," she screamed, completely losing her aristocratic composure. "You will not bring them anything if you listen to this nobody. I will have you fired. I will have this entire club shut down. I demand to speak to the general manager right now." "Perfect," I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with Beatrice. "I want to speak to him too. Let us see exactly who dictates the rules in this building." The catering director practically sprinted through the swinging kitchen doors, eager to escape the tension radiating from the head table. The ballroom remained in a state of suspended animation. The wealthy guests who usually spent their evenings gossiping and clinking glasses were completely silent, captivated by the spectacle unfolding in front of them. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance opened, and the general manager, Mr. Caldwell, strode into the room. Caldwell was a man who prided himself on absolute discretion, dressed in a flawless, tailored tuxedo. Beatrice saw him approaching and immediately puffed up her chest, her confidence returning in a rush. She assumed her rescue had arrived. "Caldwell, thank goodness." Beatrice snapped her voice, carrying an air of absolute authority. "I need you to call security immediately. This young woman is having some sort of mental breakdown. She is disrupting my private event and trying to force unauthorized guests to the head table. Remove her and those two people by the kitchen. Do it right now." Caldwell walked straight up to the elevated platform, but he did not signal for the security guards stationed at the doors. He did not even look at Beatrice. Instead, he stopped directly in front of me, clasped his hands together behind his back, and offered a deep, highly respectful bow. "I sincerely apologize for the confusion, ma'am," Caldwell said, his tone incredibly deferential. "We were not aware that you required seating adjustments at the head table. I will handle it personally and immediately." Beatrice stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. "Caldwell, what are you doing? I am the platinum member here. I am the one who booked this room and paid the deposit. Why are you bowing to my future daughter-in-law?" Caldwell finally turned to face Beatrice, his expression perfectly neutral but carrying a distinct hint of professional disdain. "Mrs. Crestview, while we value your past patronage, your platinum membership was indeed suspended 4 months ago due to severely delinquent accounts. The only reason this event was not cancelled is because we received a direct corporate override from our parent company." "Parent company," David echoed, stepping forward, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Oakwood Valley is privately owned by a local real estate syndicate." It was Caldwell corrected smoothly. "Until 3 months ago, when the syndicate defaulted on its primary loans. The property, the debt, and all operational control were acquired by Aegis Capital. And this young woman represents Aegis Capital. She is for all intents and purposes my ultimate boss. If she wants chairs at the head table, I will personally carry them out here myself." A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. The quiet murmurs erupted instantly. I watched the remaining color drain completely from David's face. He recognized the name Aegis Capital immediately. It was the exact same massive corporate firm that had just wired $200,000 to bail out his brother-in-law. The sheer impossibility of the situation was clearly short-circuiting his brain. Kendrick, however, was the first to recover. His monumental arrogance simply could not process the idea that I held actual undeniable power. He let out a loud, harsh bark of laughter, clapping his hands together slowly, as if he had just uncovered a cheap magic trick. "Oh, I get it now," Kendrick sneered, looking around the room to gather his audience. "You work for Aegis Capital. You are not just a basic admin assistant, you are a high-level corporate secretary. And what your boss felt sorry for you. He let you use his corporate account to throw your weight around at your engagement party to impress your poor parents." David latched onto this rationalization immediately, desperately needing it to be true to protect his fragile ego. "Is that what this is, Clara? You are abusing your employer's perks to humiliate my mother." That is incredibly unprofessional. If the CEO of Aegis finds out you are using their recent real estate acquisitions to settle petty family seating disputes, you will be fired by Monday morning. Beatrice let out a massive breath of relief, her posture returning to its rigid, haughty state. A secretary, she spat the word like it was poison. Playing dress-up with her boss's authority, how utterly pathetic. Caldwell. I do not care what corporate strings she pulled. This is my party. I did not bother correcting them. The fact that they were so desperate to keep me in a subordinate box was exactly what made my trap so foolproof. Let them think I was just an assistant overstepping her bounds. It would make their eventual destruction that much sweeter. Mr. Caldwell, I said calmly, ignoring the three of them entirely. The chairs, please. Right away, ma'am, Caldwell said. He snapped his fingers at the nervous catering director. Within seconds, two waitstaff members hurried out of the kitchen carrying two beautifully upholstered chairs. They quickly and quietly squeezed them into the center of the head table directly between David and me. They laid out the crystal water glasses, the heavy silver cutlery, and the fine bone china. I turned and gestured for my parents to come forward. Thomas and Helen walked up the center aisle with quiet, unbothered dignity. They took their newly placed seats at the head table right next to a seething Beatrice and a bewildered David. The power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently, and they all felt it, even if their arrogance refused to let them understand it. My parents settled into their chairs with quiet dignity, completely ignoring the daggers Beatrice was staring into the sides of their heads. The string quartet tentatively resumed playing, trying to cover the heavy, suffocating silence that had fallen over the front half of the ballroom. Guests slowly returned to their meals, exchanging furious whispers behind their linen napkins. I took a sip of my water, my hand perfectly steady. David did not sit down. He stood rigidly next to his chair, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. He looked from me to the general manager, who was now personally pouring a glass of sparkling water for my mother, and then down at his own shaking hands. The narrative he had built for himself, the illusion of total control, was cracking violently. He forced a painfully tight smile, leaning down to speak directly into my ear. "We need to talk," he whispered, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Right now. In private." Before I could agree or refuse, his hand clamped down hard on my upper arm. He did not care who saw him dragging me away from our own engagement table. He turned to the nearest guests, flashing another fake plastic smile. "Please excuse us for just one moment," he announced smoothly. "Clara and I just need to sort out a minor wedding detail. Enjoy the appetizers." He pulled me away from the bright lights of the ballroom and down a long, dimly lit corridor lined with oil paintings. I did not fight him. I let him lead me, matching his rapid pace. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the private coat room, shoved me inside, and slammed the door shut behind us. The sounds of the string quartet and the clinking glasses vanished instantly, replaced by the heavy silence of a room filled with expensive wool coats and cashmere scarves. I reached my free hand into my small satin clutch. My fingers quickly traced the familiar shape of my smartphone. Without looking, I pressed the side button to wake the screen swipe to open the voice memo widget I had placed on my lock screen, and firmly tapped the record button. I felt the tiny haptic vibration confirming that the microphone was live. I left the phone inside the open purse, angling it slightly upward. "What the hell is wrong with you, David?" exploded his voice, echoing sharply in the small room. He threw his hands in the air, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "You bring your nobody parents into this club, you threaten my mother in front of our entire social circle, and you use your boss's corporate acquisitions to show off. Do you have any idea how pathetic you look right now?" I stood perfectly still, leaning back against a rack of heavy coats. I did not cross my arms. I did not defend myself. I just watched him unravel. "You are a secretary, Clara," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You answer phones. You schedule meetings. You do not own Aegis Capital. You just work for them. Did you really think throwing around your company's name would make you look powerful? It just makes you look desperate." When your CEO finds out you are using his leverage to bully catering staff at a country club, you are going to be unemployed. And then what are you going to do? He waited for me to react. He wanted tears. He wanted me to apologize, to beg for his forgiveness, to return to the submissive role I had played perfectly for the last 2 years. But I gave him absolutely nothing. My face remained an unreadable mask of cold indifference. My silence infuriated him even more. His face turned a dark, blotchy red. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to physically intimidate me. "You need to know your place," he snarled, his breath smelling faintly of expensive champagne and blind panic. "You are lucky my family even allowed you through the front doors tonight. You are lucky I am willing to put up with your mediocre background. Do not for 1 second think that you hold any power in this relationship just because you secured a bridge loan from your boss." I tilted my head slightly, my eyes locking onto his. "Or what, David?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, entirely devoid of emotion. The calm challenge in my voice pushed him over the absolute edge. He completely lost whatever small filter he had left. "Or, I will replace you by tomorrow morning," he fired back, a cruel, triumphant smirk twisting his features. "Do you honestly think you are my only option? Do you think a man in my position is entirely dependent on a girl who rents an apartment in Queens, please? I have been entertaining a hotel heiress for the last 6 months. A woman whose family actually owns the buildings your little firm buys." He let the words hang in the heavy air, waiting for them to crush me. "She understands how our world works," David continued, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. "She does not need to fake her power. I only stayed with you this long because you were convenient and because my mother thought you would be easy to control. But if you are going to be a liability, I will drop you right here and marry her instead. She has been begging me to leave you anyway." The digital timer on my hidden phone silently ticked upward, capturing every single syllable of his confession. He had just admitted on a crystal-clear audio recording that he had been maintaining a 6-month affair with a wealthy heiress while simultaneously planning a wedding with me and orchestrating the financial abuse of my supposed savings. He thought he was breaking my heart and putting me in my place. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the final, irrefutable piece of evidence I needed to destroy his reputation publicly and permanently. "Are you finished?" I asked calmly, my voice colder than ice. David blinked, genuinely taken aback by my lack of hysterics. He opened his mouth to speak, but I did not let him. I simply turned around, placed my hand on the brass doorknob, and prepared to walk right back into the lion's den. I twisted the heavy brass doorknob and pulled the door open, stepping out of the dim coat room and back into the brightly lit corridor. David followed closely behind me. I could hear the rustle of his tuxedo jacket as he hastily smoothed down the lapels, quickly adjusting his posture to regain his polished, arrogant facade. He genuinely believed his cruel confession had broken me into submission. He thought my silence was the silence of a defeated woman who had just realized she had no other options. We walked back into the main ballroom. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Guests were picking at their appetizers, stealing sideways glances at the head table, where my parents sat quietly, completely unbothered by the toxic energy radiating from Beatrice. When David and I reappeared, a low murmur swept through the room. David moved toward his chair, a practiced, reassuring smile firmly pasted on his face, ready to play the charming host once more. But I did not go back to my seat. I bypassed the table entirely and walked straight to the center of the elevated stage, right to the microphone stand that David had used earlier. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone stand. I looked over at the string quartet playing in the corner and gave them a sharp, definitive wave of my hand. The musicians immediately stopped playing. The sudden absence of music was jarring, plunging the massive ballroom into absolute silence. Every single face in the room turned toward me. Beatrice shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. David froze halfway to his chair, his fake smile faltering as panic flashed across his features. He thought I was about to cry, to beg, or perhaps to cause a hysterical scene about his affair. I did none of those things. I stood tall, my voice completely steady and perfectly amplified through the room. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I began, my tone strictly professional, entirely devoid of the breathless joy expected of a newly engaged woman. We appreciate the time you have taken to celebrate with us. However, due to sudden and unforeseen family business, the engagement between David and myself is being put on hold, effective immediately. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Whispers erupted instantly like wildfire. David's jaw dropped. He took a step toward me, his hands raised in a frantic gesture to stop me. But I held up my hand, silencing him instantly. I was not finished. I turned my gaze directly to the head table, locking eyes with Beatrice, then Kendrick, and finally David. While the personal celebration is suspended, I continued, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. The corporate matters between our families require immediate attention. David, Beatrice, Kendrick. Your presence is required for a mandatory executive meeting this coming Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. The meeting will take place in the main boardroom of the Crestview Enterprises headquarters. Please ensure you are punctual. I lowered the microphone. The ballroom was in a state of absolute pandemonium. Guests were openly staring, exchanging shocked comments. I watched the realization hit David. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He looked at Kendrick, who was leaning forward with a sudden gleam of intense interest in his eyes. Beatrice quickly masked her initial shock with a look of calculating greed. They were connecting the dots, but they were connecting them entirely wrong. In their minds, I was just a high-level corporate secretary for Aegis Capital, the massive firm that had just bailed out Kendrick and acquired the very country club we were standing in. To them, a mandatory meeting at their failing family company headquarters could only mean one thing. They thought my boss at Aegis Capital was swooping in for a massive corporate acquisition. They thought this was their ultimate rescue, a multi-million-dollar buyout orchestrated by the powerful firm I supposedly worked for. They thought they were about to get filthy rich. David actually smiled at me, a smug, triumphant grin. He gave me a slight approving nod, thinking I had sacrificed my own dignity to secure his family's financial future just to keep him from leaving me for the heiress. I stepped down from the stage. I walked over to the head table, placed my hand on my mother's shoulder, and smiled warmly at my father. "We are leaving," I said quietly. Thomas and Helen stood up immediately. They did not say a word to Beatrice or David. They simply walked with me down the center aisle of the ballroom, our heads held high, leaving the chaotic, whispering crowd behind us. As the heavy mahogany doors of the Oakwood Valley Country Club closed behind us, I felt a deep sense of absolute peace. Let them spend their weekends celebrating their imaginary acquisition. Let them pick out new luxury cars and plan their future vacations. They had absolutely no idea that they were not walking into a boardroom negotiation on Monday. They were walking into a financial slaughterhouse, and I was holding the blade. Monday morning brought a heavy gray overcast to the city, but inside the executive suite of Crestview Enterprises, the atmosphere was electric with arrogant anticipation. The boardroom was an oversized monument to their fading legacy, featuring a massive oval table made of polished mahogany surrounded by plush leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the financial district, a view they were desperately trying to keep. The company was hemorrhaging money from every division, crushed under the weight of decades of mismanagement and Kendrick's disastrous hidden trades. But you would never know it by looking at the three people sitting at the table. Beatrice was dressed in a pristine white Chanel suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her neck adorned with pearls that she had undoubtedly retrieved from a pawn shop over the weekend just for this occasion. She was sipping espresso from a delicate porcelain cup, radiating the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just won the lottery. Next to her sat David, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit. He had spent the entire weekend ignoring my calls, completely ghosting me after our confrontation in the coat room. He was confident that our relationship was over, and that his golden ticket to the heiress was secure, especially now that his family's financial crisis was about to vanish. Kendrick paced the length of the boardroom, unable to sit still. He was wearing an even flashier suit than the one he had worn to Le Bernardin, aggressively checking his new gold Rolex every 2 minutes. "They said 9 sharp," Kendrick muttered, tapping his expensive shoes against the hardwood floor. "It is 3 minutes past. You would think a firm the size of Aegis Capital would respect punctuality." Beatrice laughed softly, setting her espresso cup down on the matching saucer. "Oh, let them take their time, Kendrick. When you are about to inject $50 million into our holding company, you are allowed to be a few minutes late. Have you reviewed the preliminary valuation numbers again? We are not settling for anything less than a 20% premium on our current stock price. They need our real estate portfolio to expand their footprint in the Northeast. We hold all the leverage." David leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Exactly. And once the acquisition clears, I am restructuring my trust. I am thinking of putting a down payment on that penthouse in Tribeca, the one with the private elevator. My new situation requires a better location." He did not say the heiress's name, but the implication hung heavily in the air. He was already spending the buyout money in his head, entirely erasing my existence from his future. "I told you guys to trust me," Kendrick boasted, finally taking a seat and resting his hands on the mahogany table. "When the margin call hit, I knew exactly how to play it. I used that little secretary to secure the bridge loan, kept us liquid through the weekend, and now we are sitting across the table from the biggest venture fund in the city. It was a masterclass in crisis management. We leveraged her tiny, insignificant life to save our empire." Beatrice smiled warmly at her son-in-law, an expression she usually reserved only for expensive jewelry. "You did brilliantly, Kendrick. I always knew she was good for something. It is almost poetic, really. The poor girl thought she was marrying into our wealth, and instead she merely served as a temporary stepping stone to secure it. I assume you handled her dismissal cleanly, David. I do not want her crying outside the building or making a scene with the press when the acquisition goes public." David scoffed, adjusting his silk tie. "She will not be a problem. I put her in her place at the country club. She knows exactly what she is. She's probably back in Queens right now, typing up memos and trying to figure out how to pay her rent." The sheer volume of their delusion was staggering. They were sitting in a sinking ship, actively cheering for the water rushing in, completely convinced it was champagne. They honestly believed that Aegis Capital, a notoriously ruthless firm, known for hostile takeovers and aggressive corporate restructuring, was coming to hand them a massive check out of the goodness of its heart. They had spent the entire weekend validating each other's greed, building a towering fantasy of immense wealth and zero consequences. Kendrick checked his watch again, sighing loudly. 5 minutes late. This CEO better be bringing a very large pen. I am not sitting here all day playing corporate games. We give them our terms, they sign the check, and we go celebrate at the club. At exactly 6 minutes past 9, the heavy double doors of the boardroom finally clicked unlocked. The brass handles began to turn slowly. "Here we go," David whispered, sitting up straight and buttoning his suit jacket. "Look sharp. Remember, we do not look desperate. We let them make the first offer." Beatrice smoothed the skirt of her white suit and adopted an expression of aristocratic boredom. Kendrick stopped tapping his fingers and leaned forward, his eyes locked aggressively on the opening doors, ready to dominate whoever walked through them. The doors swung open, revealing the polished hallway outside. The stage was set perfectly for the arrival of their corporate savior. They were entirely unprepared for the executioner who was actually coming. The heavy double doors swung open, but it was not a team of friendly venture capitalists looking to hand out millions of dollars. 3 men in immaculate dark charcoal suits walked into the room in absolute silence. They were Wall Street corporate litigators, the kind of men who did not smile, did not make small talk, and only appeared when a company was about to be dismantled. They moved with predatory efficiency, setting their thick leather briefcases down on the polished mahogany table. Beatrice frowned, clearly unsettled by their grim demeanor. She opened her mouth to demand an introduction, but before she could speak, the doors opened a second time. I stepped over the threshold and the oxygen immediately vanished from the room. I was no longer wearing the simple unbranded fabrics I used to play the submissive girlfriend. I was wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored Tom Ford power suit in midnight blue. My hair was sleek, my posture completely transformed. My shoulders were back, my chin high, exuding the kind of terrifying, unshakable confidence that only comes from holding absolute control. The soft, nervous girl from Queens who apologized for existing was dead. I walked slowly into the boardroom, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. Kendrick stared at me, his jaw dropping slightly, as if he had just seen an apparition. Beatrice froze her delicate porcelain cup, pausing halfway to her lips, her eyes widening in sheer disbelief. I did not look at any of them. I bypassed the guest chairs entirely and walked straight to the head of the oval table. I reached the oversized leather chair reserved strictly for the chief executive officer of Crestview Enterprises, pulled it out and sat down. I crossed my legs and folded my hands neatly on the polished wood. The three ruthless litigators immediately took their places behind me, flanking my chair like a silent, impenetrable guard. The silence stretched for an agonizing 10 seconds. It was the sound of three massive egos short-circuiting simultaneously. Then the denial kicked in. David let out a sudden high-pitched, nervous laugh. It was a pathetic sound bouncing awkwardly off the glass walls. His brain was desperately trying to force the reality in front of him back into a box he could understand. "Clara, what on earth are you doing here?" David asked, his voice cracking slightly. He stood up, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. "Did you follow the Aegis representatives into the building?" "Babe, you cannot be in here. This is a highly confidential corporate acquisition meeting. You are going to get yourself fired and ruin our entire deal. Get out of that chair right now before someone reports you to human resources." He took a step toward me, reaching out as if he was going to physically pull me out of the seat, but one of the litigators stepped forward, fixing David with a stare so cold it stopped him dead in his tracks. Beatrice slammed her espresso cup down on the saucer, the china clattering loudly in the quiet room. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of red. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You vindictive little brat! Are you so desperate for my son's attention that you broke into our headquarters to play dress-up in the boardroom?" She turned her furious glare toward the three silent lawyers standing behind me. "Well, do not just stand there like idiots. Remove your secretary from our executive chair immediately. She is trespassing on private property. If you do not escort her out of this building right now, I will personally call security. Have your entire acquisition team thrown out onto the street and call your boss to ensure you are all terminated by lunch." Kendrick finally found his voice. He looked from me to the lawyers, his arrogance momentarily wavering. "Listen to her," he snapped, trying to sound authoritative. "We are here to finalize a $50 million buyout. We do not have time for disgruntled administrative assistants trying to stage a dramatic protest. Get her out of here so we can talk numbers." The lead litigator, a tall man with piercing eyes, did not even blink at their threats. He did not apologize, and he certainly did not ask me to move. Instead, he reached into his heavy briefcase, pulled out a thick black leather-bound dossier, and placed it gently on the table directly in front of me. He flipped it open, revealing thick stacks of legally binding financial documents, all bearing the digital signatures of the men sitting across from me. I looked at David, letting a slow, calculated smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a predator that had finally trapped its prey. "I am not playing dress-up, David," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm and authoritative register. "I am not trespassing, and nobody is going to throw me out. I suggest you all sit down and listen very carefully, because the meeting has officially begun." None of them moved. They stood frozen around the polished mahogany table, staring at me as if the laws of physics had just spontaneously reversed. The lead litigator, Mr. Preston, stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, but his tone demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience from every single person in the room. "Sit down," Mr. Preston commanded, his voice slicing cleanly through the thick, suffocating air. You requested an emergency meeting with the head of our firm to discuss the collateral standing of your recent bridge loan. You are now in the presence of the founder, sole chief executive officer, and majority shareholder of Aegis Capital. Her name is Clara. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Beatrice's knees seemed to give out simultaneously. She collapsed back into her plush leather chair, her pristine white Chanel suit suddenly looking less like a symbol of aristocratic power and more like a desperate surrender flag. David stumbled backward, his hand blindly catching the edge of the table to steady himself. His mouth opened and closed silently, unable to form a single coherent word as the monumental scale of his mistake finally crushed the breath out of his lungs. Kendrick was the only one still standing, though his aggressive, domineering posture had completely vanished. He looked at Mr. Preston, then at me, shaking his head in a frantic, jerky motion. No. That is impossible. Kendrick stammered, his voice stripped of all its former bravado. She is an administrative assistant. She lives in a rented brick box in Queens. I saw her bank account with my own eyes. She had $2,000 to her name. You are playing a joke. This is a ridiculous prank. I reached out and rested my hand flat on the thick black leather dossier in front of me. You saw a dummy account, Kendrick, I replied smoothly, my voice echoing in the dead silent boardroom. An account I use exclusively to pay for minor subscription services. Just like you saw a bespoke Loro Piana dress at Le Bernardin, and immediately assumed it was cheap because it lacked a flashy logo. You were so blinded by your own desperate need to feel superior that you never bothered to do a basic background check on the woman your brother-in-law was bringing into your fragile inner circle. I pushed the heavy dossier across the table. It glided smoothly, coming to a stop precisely between David and Kendrick. Open it, I commanded. David reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the heavy leather cover open. Inside was a comprehensive, meticulously documented portfolio of every single financial disaster their family had spent the last decade trying to hide. Let us talk about financial value. Beatrice, I said, leaning back in my executive chair and locking eyes with my former future mother-in-law. Do you remember the lecture you gave me over caviar? You told me I brought absolutely no value to this union. You said your family had massive corporate assets and a pristine reputation to protect from working-class gold diggers. You mocked my parents' billionaire philanthropists who could buy and sell this entire building before breakfast, asking if they used public transit. Beatrice visibly shrank into her seat, her face turning an ashen, sickly gray. She could not speak. The sheer terror of her reality was paralyzing her. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger to the first stack of papers in the folder. Page 1 is the deed to your Hamptons estate, Beatrice. Aegis Capital quietly purchased that debt from your primary lender 3 months ago after you missed your 4th consecutive mortgage payment. Page 2 is the consolidated corporate debt of Crestview Enterprises, which is currently operating at a massive, unsustainable deficit. And page 3, I shifted my cold gaze to Kendrick, whose eyes were wide with pure panic. Page 3 is the 29% interest convertible note you so eagerly signed last week to save yourself from federal fraud charges. You used my money to satisfy your margin call. I continued, my voice sharp as a blade. And less than 48 hours later, you bought a solid gold luxury watch and bragged about your market liquidity on social media. That screenshot is sitting in a file ready to be sent to the Securities and Exchange Commission as proof of gross misappropriation of corporate funds. Your career in finance is officially dead. David looked up at me, his face completely pale, his eyes filling with tears of sheer panic. Clara, he whispered, his voice cracking violently. You set us up. You tricked us. I did not trick anyone, David, I replied coldly. I simply matched your energy. You pushed me to bail out your fraudulent brother-in-law while simultaneously letting your mother treat me like garbage. You dragged me into a coat room and threatened to replace me with an heiress if I did not know my place. Well, you are finally looking at my place. My firm owns your house. My firm owns your country club. And as of this morning, my firm holds the exclusive rights to liquidate your entire existence. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Kendrick's rapid, shallow breathing. He lunged forward, his hands shaking violently as he grabbed the third document from the dossier. His eyes darted back and forth across the dense legal text, desperately searching for a loophole he knew he would not find. He had signed it blindly arrogant, and rushed, never expecting a trap from the woman he deemed beneath his notice. "Let us break down the math, Kendrick," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. Exactly 30 days ago, Apex Financial Services, a wholly owned subsidiary of Aegis Capital, wired $200,000 into your clearing account to save you from a catastrophic margin call. The terms of that bridge loan dictated a 29% annualized interest rate with the principal and interest due in full upon the maturity date. That maturity date expired at exactly midnight last night. You failed to make a single payment. Kendrick dropped the paper, staring at me with hollow, terrified eyes. "We just need an extension," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "A standard corporate grace period. I can liquidate some secondary assets by Friday. I can get you the cash. There are no extensions." I replied, my voice hard and unyielding. "You do not dictate the terms anymore. Because you defaulted, we immediately triggered the convertible note clause buried in page 6 of the agreement you so eagerly signed." David finally found his voice, though it sounded weak and strangled. "A convertible note. What does that mean? Clara, what did you do?" "I did not do anything, David." I corrected him. "You did. When Kendrick needed collateral for the loan, he used Crestview Enterprises. And you, in your infinite desperation and stunning lack of financial literacy, signed the document as the chief operating officer, legally binding the company as the guarantor. You authorized the pledge." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle over them like a concrete block. "The clause explicitly states that upon default, the outstanding debt automatically converts into equity. Because of the aggressive risk profile of the loan and the distressed valuation of your company, that conversion rate equates to exactly 60% of the voting shares of Crestview Enterprises. As of this morning, Aegis Capital is the majority shareholder. We own the controlling stake. This is no longer your family business. It is my subsidiary." Beatrice let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp, clutching her pearl necklace as if she were physically choking. 60%, she shrieked. "You stole our company. You orchestrated a hostile takeover." Kendrick was not listening to Beatrice. He was staring at his shaking hands, the realization of his actions finally crashing down on him. The loss of the family company was the least of his problems. He was a licensed financial professional and he had just committed corporate suicide. "I do not actually own 60% of Crestview, Kendrick," whispered, his face completely devoid of color. He looked at David, his eyes wide with rising terror. "I do not own any voting shares. I only have a minority advisory stake through Natalie. I could not legally pledge the company as collateral." "Exactly," I said, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. "You pledged assets you did not fully own to secure a massive private loan for your personal brokerage account. You falsified your asset declaration. And David, you authorized it without the unanimous consent of your board of directors, breaching your fiduciary duty. Do you know what the Securities and Exchange Commission calls that, Kendrick?" Kendrick swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat dripping down his temple. He knew exactly what it was called. "It is wire fraud," I stated cleanly. "It is corporate fraud, it is misrepresentation of collateral, and it is a direct violation of federal financial regulations. The moment my lawyers file this defaulted note with the regulatory authorities, your wealth management license will be permanently revoked. Your firm will be audited and the federal government will open a criminal investigation into your trading history. You are not just going to lose your job, Kendrick, you are looking at federal prison time." Kendrick gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as he tried to keep himself from collapsing out of his chair. The arrogant man who had mocked my clothing, demanded to see my bank account, and treated me like a peasant was completely gone. In his place sat a ruined, terrified criminal who had just destroyed his own life with a single signature. My career is over. Kendrick gasped, staring blankly at the polished wood. Everything is gone. It was over the moment you demanded I open my banking app at Le Bernardin, I replied coldly. You wanted total financial transparency. Now you are getting it. Beatrice suddenly pushed herself up from the table, her chair screeching harshly against the polished hardwood floor. The sheer terror that had paralyzed her just moments ago abruptly morphed into a wild, desperate rage. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. You are lying! Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing frantically off the glass walls. You cannot do any of this. You cannot touch Crestview Enterprises, and you certainly cannot touch my personal estate. You are forgetting one very important detail, you foolish little girl. The prenuptial agreement. David snapped his head toward his mother, a sudden flicker of desperate hope lighting up his pale face. Kendrick stopped hyperventilating for a fraction of a second, looking up from his hands. That is right, David gasped, gripping the edge of the table. The prenup. You signed it at the restaurant. It is legally binding. Beatrice let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, pacing a few steps behind her chair. She looked at my lawyers with a triumphant sneer. Did she conveniently forget to tell her legal team about that I forced her to sign a comprehensive, airtight prenuptial agreement drafted by the best family law attorneys in the city? It explicitly states that she has absolutely zero claim to any corporate assets, real estate, or family trusts. She waived every single right. The document is heavily fortified. If she tries to seize this company or foreclose on my home, that contract will instantly block the transfer. You have nothing, Clara. Your little trap is completely useless. I did not break my calm, steady posture. I rested my chin on my folded hands and offered Beatrice a slow, chilling smile. It was the smile of a chess player who had just watched their opponent confidently move their king onto a rigged square. I did not forget about the prenuptial agreement, Beatrice, I replied softly. In fact, it is my absolute favorite part of this entire transaction. Mr. Preston, if you would be so kind. The lead litigator stepped forward. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a familiar stack of crisp white papers. It was the exact document Kendrick had aggressively snatched off the table at Le Bernardin. Mr. Preston placed it gently on the mahogany table, flipping directly to page 42. Beatrice frowned, stepping closer to the table, her triumphant sneer faltering slightly. What is that? She demanded. This is the finalized signed copy of your prenuptial agreement. Mrs. Crestview, Mr. Preston said, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a surgeon about to make a fatal incision. Specifically, this is the addendum located at the bottom of page 42, the clause you and your son-in-law failed to review before placing this document into your legal vault. Mr. Preston adjusted his glasses and began to read aloud, his voice projecting clearly across the silent boardroom. By signing this document, the bride is hereby fully and permanently indemnified against any pre-existing current or future debts, liabilities, and financial obligations incurred by the groom, his immediate family, or their affiliated corporate entities. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. So what? That just means she does not have to pay our debts. It does not give her the right to steal our company. Mr. Preston did not look up from the page. He simply continued reading the second half of the clause. Furthermore, should the groom or any member of his immediate family commit an act of financial fraud, asset misrepresentation, or breach of fiduciary duty during the engagement period, all asset protection clauses within this agreement are immediately rendered null and void. In the event of such a breach, the groom and his family explicitly forfeit their right to contest, block, or litigate any financial actions, asset seizures, or debt collections executed by the bride or any corporate entity under her direct control. The boardroom fell so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. Mr. Preston closed the document and looked directly at David. When you, as Chief Operating Officer, illegally authorized the pledging of corporate assets, you did not fully control to secure a high-yield loan for your brother-in-law, you committed federal wire fraud. That act of fraud occurred during the engagement period. By the strict definitions of the contract your own mother forced upon her, you triggered the penalty clause. I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the absolute devastation wash over them. You designed that contract to trap a poor naive girl, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. You wanted to make sure I would be completely powerless and dependent on your supposed wealth. But you were so arrogant, so blindingly certain of your own superiority, that you never bothered to check if the weapon you handed me was loaded. I initialed that clause right in front of you, Kendrick. You literally handed me the pen. Kendrick buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, agonizing groan. David stared at the prenuptial agreement sitting on the table, his eyes wide with sheer horror, as he realized his own signature on the loan document was the exact trigger that had destroyed his family's defenses. You signed away your right to fight me, I stated cleanly. You cannot tie this up in court. You cannot file an injunction. You waived your right to legal contest. The acquisition is final, the foreclosure on your estate is proceeding uncontested, and there is absolutely nothing your lawyers can do to stop it. The absolute finality of my words hung in the boardroom, suffocating the last remnants of their arrogance. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her trembling hands flew to her neck, clutching her pearl choker so tightly that the delicate silk thread snapped. Dozens of perfectly round pearls cascaded down her crisp white Chanel suit, bouncing off the mahogany table and scattering across the hardwood floor like tiny hollow hailstones. She did not even try to catch them. Please, Clara. Beatrice begged, her voice dissolving into a wet, pathetic wheeze. Tears ruined her immaculate makeup, cutting dark tracks down her pale cheeks. You cannot take my home. I have lived in that estate for 30 years. It is my entire life. We are family. You are going to be my daughter. We can fix this. I will make David marry you tomorrow. You can have the wedding in Italy. I will pay for the flights. I will do whatever you want. I stared down at the weeping woman who had tried to relegate my parents to a kitchen break table just 2 nights ago. You are not losing your home, Beatrice, I stated flatly. You are losing a house you stopped being able to afford months ago, and we were never going to be family. You made that abundantly clear the moment you handed me that prenuptial agreement. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending to care about me now that I hold the deed to your life. Beatrice slumped forward, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, uncontrollable sobs. I turned my attention away from her entirely and locked my eyes onto David. He was standing perfectly still, his face frozen in a mask of pure shock. As the new majority shareholder of Crestview Enterprises, I have thoroughly reviewed the executive leadership structure of this company. I announced, my voice switching to a crisp, professional cadence. David, your tenure as Chief Operating Officer has been defined by gross negligence, reckless spending, and a complete failure of fiduciary responsibility. Your decision to illegally leverage corporate assets to cover a personal family debt is the final offense. David blinked rapidly, shaking his head. Clara, wait. You cannot just fire me. I know the operational logistics of this entire firm. You need me for the transition. We can work together. I am still your partner. You are a liability, I corrected him sharply. You are hereby terminated from your position as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. Because your termination is a direct result of documented corporate fraud and gross misconduct, you will receive absolutely no severance package, no continuation of benefits, and no stock options. Place your corporate keycard, your company credit cards, and your secure phone on the table. Right now. David reached into his tailored suit jacket with trembling fingers. He pulled out his sleek corporate smartphone and his platinum company card, placing them carefully on the polished wood. He looked utterly hollowed out, a man who had just watched his entire identity evaporate into thin air. I then turned to the far end of the table where Kendrick was still sitting. He looked physically ill. His flashy Tom Ford suit hung awkwardly on his frame, suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Mr. Preston, I said, not taking my eyes off Kendrick. Please call security. The lead litigator pulled a small radio from his pocket and murmured a brief command. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy double doors swung open again. Two massive, broad-shouldered security guards stepped into the boardroom. They were not Crestview personnel. They wore the dark tactical suits of Aegis Capital's private security detail. Kendrick, you are currently trespassing on private property owned by my firm, I stated cleanly. You will be escorted out of this building immediately. You will not be allowed to return to your desk. We will have your personal belongings boxed up and shipped to whatever address you provide to the guards. Kendrick slowly stood up. He tried to straighten his tie, a desperate final attempt to salvage a shred of his dignity, but his hands were shaking too badly. Clara, please. He whispered, his arrogant swagger completely destroyed. If you report this, I will go to prison. I have a family. I have a career. You had a career. I corrected him without a single ounce of pity. The moment the wire transfer hit your account last month, you sealed your own fate. Your fraudulent loan application, complete with the falsified asset declarations you provided, has already been compiled into a formal report. My legal team messengered it to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission at 8 o'clock this morning. They are likely drafting the arrest warrants as we speak. I highly recommend you spend the rest of your day securing a very good criminal defense attorney. The two security guards stepped forward, each taking a firm hold of Kendrick's arms. He did not fight them. He let out a quiet, defeated whimper, his chin dropping to his chest as they physically turned him around. The man who had mocked my unbranded clothes and demanded to see my bank account was paraded out of the boardroom in absolute disgrace. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, sealing his ruin. The heavy double doors clicked shut behind Kendrick, sealing his fate and leaving a ringing silence in the massive boardroom. Beatrice was still slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands, her quiet sobs the only sound breaking the stillness. David stood alone at the edge of the mahogany table, stripped of his corporate identity, his phone and his credit cards. He looked at the empty space where his brother-in-law had just been standing, and the absolute finality of the situation finally shattered his mind. The polished, arrogant air evaporated entirely. David's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, the expensive fabric of his custom navy suit wrinkling as he fell. He did not try to stand back up. Instead, he scrambled forward on his knees, crawling toward the head of the table where I sat surrounded by my legal team. His hands reached out desperately, grasping the armrest of my leather executive chair. "Clara, please," David begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "You have made your point. You won. You completely destroyed Kendrick, and you took the company. I surrender. But please do not throw me away like this. We love each other. We were supposed to get married next month. We were building a life together." I looked down at his tear-stained face. He was actually trying to weaponize the very relationship he had spent the last 2 years exploiting. "I know I made mistakes," David continued, tears streaming down his face, spilling onto his silk tie. "I was under so much pressure from my mother and the board to keep the company afloat. I let the stress turn me into someone I am not. But everything I did to protect our future. You know my heart, Clara. You know I love you. We can start over, just you and me." I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no heartbreak, no lingering affection. The man kneeling at my feet was a complete stranger, a hollow shell of a person who only valued love when it could be used as a shield against the consequences of his own actions. I slowly reached into the pocket of my Tom Ford suit and pulled out my smartphone. I did not say a word to him. I simply swiped the screen, opening the settings menu, and activated the Bluetooth connection. I tapped the pairing option for the Crestview Enterprises Executive Boardroom audio system. A soft chime echoed from the discreet speakers embedded in the ceiling, confirming the connection was established. "What are you doing?" David whispered, his desperate pleading faltering as confusion washed over his face. I opened my audio files and selected the voice memo I had recorded just 2 nights ago. I turned the media volume on my phone all the way up and pressed play. The high-fidelity speakers suspended above our heads crackled to life. Suddenly, David's own voice filled the massive room, crisp and incredibly loud, echoing off the glass walls. "You need to know your place," the recorded voice snarled, dripping with the exact arrogant venom he had used in the country club coatroom. "You are lucky my family even allowed you through the front doors tonight. You are lucky I am willing to put up with your mediocre background." David froze. The blood drained completely from his face. He tried to scramble backward, scrambling away from the sound of his own cruelty, but the audio kept playing, filling every corner of the room. "Or I will replace you by tomorrow morning," the recording continued. "Do you honestly think you are my only option? I have been entertaining a hotel heiress for the last 6 months. She does not need to fake her power. I only stayed with you this long because you were convenient. If you are going to be a liability, I will drop you right here and marry her instead." I tapped the screen, stopping the playback. The sudden silence that followed was heavier than a physical weight. Beatrice slowly lifted her head from her hands, her tear-ruined eyes wide with shock. Even she had not known about the heiress. She had genuinely believed David was keeping me around solely as a financial pawn. David knelt on the floor, staring blankly at the mahogany table. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Every lie, every manipulation, every shred of his fake superiority had been exposed and weaponized against him. I reached over to my left hand. I gripped the diamond engagement ring that his mother had selected for me, the ring that was supposed to symbolize my entry into their prestigious legacy. I pulled it smoothly off my finger. I looked down at the pathetic, ruined man kneeling before me. I tossed the heavy diamond ring directly at him. The ring hit the lapel of his tailored navy jacket. It bounced sharply off his chest and hit the floor, rolling in a slow, agonizing circle before coming to a complete stop near his knees. "Go marry your heiress, David," I said, my voice as cold and absolute as a steel blade. "Let us see if she still wants to merge assets with a bankrupt, unemployed felon." I turned my back on David. He was still kneeling on the floor, his shoulders shaking as he stared blankly at the diamond ring resting near his shoes. I had absolutely nothing left to say to him. He was a closed chapter. I walked slowly around the massive mahogany table, the sharp click of my heels breaking the heavy silence until I was standing directly next to Beatrice. She slowly raised her head from her hands. Her face, usually a perfect mask of aristocratic superiority, was completely ruined. Her expensive makeup was smeared across her cheeks, and her eyes were bloodshot and wide with a primal, suffocating terror. The string of pearls she had broken earlier still lay scattered across the polished wood, a perfect metaphor for her shattered illusion of control. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken rasp. "Clara, I am begging you. You have taken the company. You have ruined Kendrick. You have punished David. I have nothing else. You cannot take my home. It is the only thing I have left in this world." I looked down at her, my expression completely impassive. I remembered the way she had looked at me at Le Bernardin, her eyes filled with utter disgust as she told me I brought no value to her family. I remembered how she had relegated my parents' people of immense grace and actual substance to a kitchen break table just to make herself feel powerful. "You do not have a home. Beatrice," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You have a massive liability that you have been using as a stage to perform your fake wealth. You have not made a mortgage payment on that Hamptons estate in over 90 days. Your primary lender was already preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings before you even handed me that prenuptial agreement." Beatrice shook her head frantically, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. "The bank gave me a grace period," she stammered defensively, clinging to a lie that had already expired. "They told my financial advisor they would work with us." "Your financial advisor was Kendrick," I reminded her cleanly. "And Kendrick lied to you. The bank did not give you a grace period. They bundled your toxic mortgage into a distressed asset portfolio and sold it to the highest bidder to get it off their books. And the highest bidder was Aegis Capital. I bought your debt for pennies on the dollar, Beatrice. I own the paper. I own the land. and I own the house. I held out my right hand without looking back. Mr. Preston immediately stepped forward and placed a crisp, heavy manila envelope into my palm. I tossed the envelope onto the mahogany table. It landed directly on top of her scattered pearls. Beatrice stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "That is a formal legally binding notice of eviction," I stated. "Because you waived your right to contest asset seizures in the very contract you forced me to sign, my legal team expedited the foreclosure process through the state courts over the weekend. A judge signed off on the final order at 8 o'clock this morning." I leaned down, placing both of my hands on the table, bringing my face level with hers. I wanted her to see the absolute certainty in my eyes. "You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises," I told her, articulating every single word with deliberate precision. "You are permitted to take your personal clothing and whatever jewelry you actually own outright. Everything else, the imported furniture, the artwork, the crystal chandeliers, belongs to Aegis Capital to offset the massive deficit you accumulated." 72 hours! Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "Clara, that is impossible. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to pack my entire life into boxes in 3 days? I do not have any liquid cash to rent an apartment. I do not have anywhere to live." I stood back up, straightening my suit jacket. "That sounds like a problem for someone in the working class, Beatrice. Perhaps you can ask your country club friends if you can sleep on their luxury sofas. Or maybe you can finally learn how to navigate the public transit system you love to mock so much." Beatrice let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying her face back into her arms, as the reality of her total destitution finally crushed her. She was entirely broken, stripped of her title, her wealth, and her dignity. "At our engagement dinner, you explicitly told me to know my place," I said, looking down at the sobbing matriarch one last time. "My place is sitting at the head of this boardroom, running a billion-dollar fund. Your place is packing your bags before my private security team physically removes you from my property on Thursday morning." 3 weeks later, the crisp autumn air of Manhattan felt entirely different. It felt clean. I stepped through the heavy glass doors of Le Bernardin, the exact same Michelin-starred restaurant where this entire ordeal had begun. But this time I was not wearing a simple dress to hide my reality, and I was not sitting across from people who viewed my existence as a liability. The maitre d' greeted me by name, bowing slightly before leading me to the best table in the main dining room, far away from the prying eyes of the other patrons. Waiting for me were my parents, Thomas and Helen. They were dressed in their usual understated elegance. My father wore a soft charcoal cashmere blazer, and my mother wore a beautifully tailored silk blouse. To the untrained eye, they still looked remarkably ordinary. But the restaurant staff, well trained in recognizing true quiet wealth, attended to them with the utmost reverence. There were no sneers, no prenuptial agreements slammed onto the table next to the appetizers, and absolutely no conversations about protecting a fragile legacy from outsiders. I sat down, and the sommelier immediately poured us glasses of a rare vintage champagne. My father raised his crystal flute, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a warm, genuine smile. "To smart investments," my father said, his voice rich with quiet pride. "And to knowing exactly when to liquidate toxic assets." I smiled, clinking my glass against his. "To freedom," I added. We took a sip, and the conversation naturally shifted to the cleanup of the past few weeks. The transition of Crestview Enterprises into an Aegis Capital subsidiary had been swift and brutal. David was officially unemployed and entirely blacklisted from the financial sector. He had tried calling me dozens of times from unknown numbers, leaving desperate voicemails begging for a second chance, but my legal team had swiftly issued a permanent restraining order. Without his corporate title and his supposed trust fund, the hotel heiress he had bragged about dumped him within 48 hours. He was currently renting a tiny studio apartment in New Jersey, drowning in insurmountable legal fees. Kendrick was faring much worse. The Securities and Exchange Commission had moved with terrifying speed. His brokerage accounts were frozen, his license was permanently revoked, and he was currently out on bail, awaiting federal trial for wire fraud. As for Beatrice, my private security team had executed the eviction exactly 72 hours after our boardroom meeting. She had tried reaching out to her country club friends for help, but the moment they realized her wealth was a complete fabrication, they stopped answering her calls. She was now living in a cramped two-bedroom condo on the outskirts of the city, entirely cut off from the society she had valued above human decency. My mother reached across the pristine white tablecloth and covered my hand with hers. "I am so proud of you, Clara," she said softly. "Not just for acquiring a company, but for refusing to let them break your spirit. You stood your ground when it mattered most." Her words settled deeply into my chest, replacing the last lingering echoes of David's gaslighting. Looking around the elegant dining room, I realized that the greatest victory was not the corporate takeover or the millions of dollars added to my portfolio. The real triumph was the absolute reclamation of my own worth. For 2 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into a mold created by a man who was terrified of my potential. I had hidden my success, my intelligence, and my financial independence just to make David feel like a provider. I had allowed his mother to insult my bloodline because society conditions women to keep the peace at all costs, especially when it comes to the families of the men we love. We are taught to compromise our boundaries to endure disrespect, and to wait for a man to recognize our value. But true power does not come from a diamond ring resting on your left hand. True power does not come from a man promising to take care of you while secretly using you to fund his own illusions. True power is financial literacy. It is the ability to read the fine print, to understand the mechanics of a convertible note, and to build your own safety net so thick that nobody can ever push you to the ground. It is the strength to set ironclad boundaries and the ruthless willingness to enforce them the second they are crossed. I picked up my champagne glass, addressing every woman who has ever been told she is too much, too ambitious, or not enough. Never apologize for your success. Never dim your light to make a fragile ego feel comfortable in the dark. If someone demands that you prove your worth, show them the door, not your bank account. And if they ever try to hand you a contract designed to keep you small, make absolutely sure you are the one holding the pen. My name is Clara, founder and CEO of Aegis Capital, and this is just the beginning of my empire. Clara's journey reveals a harsh but necessary truth about relationships, power, and self-worth. Far too often, women are socially conditioned to make themselves smaller to keep the peace. We are taught to dim our light, hide our success, and compromise our boundaries, just to accommodate the fragile egos of the people we love. Clara played the role of the submissive, financially dependent partner because she believed that was what her relationship required. However, her fiancé and his family immediately weaponized that perceived vulnerability against her. They used a predatory prenuptial agreement, their fabricated social status, and outright financial abuse to try and trap her in a corner. Their behavior teaches us a crucial lesson. Anyone who demands your subservience as a condition for their acceptance does not actually love you. They only love the control they hold over you. Clara's ultimate victory was not just about executing a brilliant corporate takeover. It was the powerful realization that her true safety lay in her financial literacy, her independence, and her absolute refusal to remain a victim. When she finally stopped pretending and stepped fully into her authentic power, the toxic facade of her future in-laws completely crumbled. Financial independence is not merely about accumulating wealth. It is about having choices, setting ironclad boundaries, and holding the ultimate authority over your own destiny. You should never have to sacrifice your dignity to earn a seat at a table that does not value your mind. We must stop apologizing for our ambition and start demanding the respect we rightfully deserve. If you have ever felt pressured to shrink yourself to make someone else comfortable, share your story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more empowering narratives.